So again, it's now our question and answer period. And there are 2 microphones here in the aisle. So if you have a question, you can either raise your hand and they'll come to you, or you can make your way to them. We'll start with this gentleman right here.
As a young person and a millennial whose peers are going to be in a lot of ways deciding the fate of where this country goes in the next 30 to 60 years, how do I get my peers and myself to listen to others, and especially the more zealous people who might be a little more closed-minded? How do I get them to listen?
Well, Jim Leach, the question is from a millennial, and he says, how do I get others to listen? And I am assuming you're saying not just to my point of view, just to not my point of view. What did you tell others about civility and listening? We talked a little bit about listening here this evening.
Well, you've got a really terrific question, and part of it relates to how you go about speaking and where you go about doing the speaking. And let me come back to kind of modify a little bit what Kay said. The problem isn't that you have no big audiences. Donald Trump had the largest. The largest audiences were the ones that no one else could talk to him, and he couldn't hear from anybody else. And that the bigger the media is, the less the candidate is really involved in a discourse with the audience. And so one of the aspects of a society is, how do you participate in public life? And public life begins in communities, and we forget that there are basically 4 institutions of government: the national level, the state level, the county level, the city level. And if you take from the bottom up and you take the state of Iowa as a model, things are working rather well. And the biggest problems are from the top down. And so one aspect, and it's one of the greatest cases for the Iowa caucuses, is that we are the closest to having candidates be in an environment where people can actually talk to them. But even there you see front-running candidates manipulate this, and they have kind of very small things that they control with audiences they control. And so one of the models that every elected official, like Neil as a congressman, David as a congressman, when I was a congressman, we'd have town meetings. And anybody could come and you'd be on the spot, and you'd have to take any question they had. And there is no audience that doesn't know when someone in public life isn't frail in their logic or arrogant in their manners. Iowa really stands out as doing well, and that's one of the lessons to take away. Now,
what is one of the lessons?
That Iowa's citizenry responded rather well to the process. Iowa's citizenry was not given the best possible candidates at the national level.
Well, I'll make an assumption, which you know what they say about assumptions, but maybe you were talking about how you can get millennials like you to have a conversation with one another about politics. Is that the genesis of your question? Yeah. So I'll tell you a little anecdote. I cleaned my garage Tuesday, and my next door neighbor saw that I had cleaned my garage, and as soon as the door came down, my doorbell rang, and it was my neighbor who wanted to talk to me about the election. But he didn't really want to talk to me about the election and hear my view. He wanted to tell me what he thought about the election. And so we stood on my front doorstep for half an hour having a face-to-face conversation. And I know a lot more about him because I stood there face-to-face and listened to him. So my advice to millennials or to senior citizens is to turn off the television, set down your iPhone, and actually have a conversation with the person who may live next door to you, be in the next dorm room, be at the same library table with you in the Drake University Library. Have a conversation with a human Because when you appreciate their humanity, you understand that just because they have an opinion that's different than you doesn't make them inhuman.
Two quick comments more. Dave Nagle wants to comment, and then Kathie.
I appreciate your question, and let me suggest to you that the first thing to do in terms of how to get people more involved as a politician is I say to them this. I say, what do you think? I ask for their opinion first, and I listen to their opinion. And I find from their opinion the areas to where I can agree and the areas where I think I can disagree respectfully and the areas where I can forge an agreement. I think the first question you have to ask is to say, how do we get other people to share our opinions, is ask them their thought first and then respond appropriately rather than tell them what you think and then ask them in a defensive manner to agree or disagree.
Kathie.
I would just say, in support of what Kay mentioned about face-to-face communication, that the Obama campaign in Iowa actually measured every way that they reached out to voters. The phone calls and the results from the phone calls, the advertising, the results from the advertising. And you know what had the best result to actually get people out to vote? Door knocking. And actually talking to people one-on-one. And you look at the fact that young people broke records in their turnout in 2008, and they pretty much, and they stayed home in greater numbers in 2016, even though there were groups that were organizing door knocking that was aimed at young voters. So I do think that face-to-face communication is really important.
I'm going to go to the center here.
Thank you, and thank you for, my name's Clay Pasquale, I'm a junior here at Drake, and thank you for knowing the value of door knocking, because I've done a lot of it in my time, so I appreciate that. Yeah, I had a different question originally, but I'm switching it now, because I feel like you folks just answered it. So, do you think that social media like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, do you think it's making the partisan divide worse? Do you think it's polarizing us more, or do you think it's more of a civic tool that's helping us become more knowledgeable and talk with each other about politics?
Yeah, I love anecdotes. So let me tell you about a young woman I met. She was 21, and I said at the beginning of our conversation, so who do you plan to vote for? And she said, I don't know who the candidates are. And she did not know who the candidates are because she gets her news from Facebook. And on her Facebook feed, which is populated by her Facebook friends, none of whom are interested in politics, there was no news on her Facebook feed about the election.
Dennis Goldford.
43% of eligible voters did not vote in this election, right? And at one level, you could argue that's a freedom not to vote. But on the other hand, as you said at the outset, echoing President Obama from 8 years ago, elections have consequences. And so you've got to participate. But I thought in terms of that original question, and Clay's as well, you know, how often do we see millennials sitting next to each other, both buried in their cell phones and not even talking to each other? Put the damn phones down and talk to each other rather than texting each other. That's the first step. Part of the problem, again, for this disastrous level of anger and awful things that are said is that people can say something evidently on social media, and I don't do social media, but what I hear is that without any personal accountability, you can do it anonymously.
I wonder if, hasn't that train left the station, the ship has sailed?
Yeah.
And I think that social media can be a great tool for people to have conversation and people to have a voice. You talk about, you know, how can I get somebody to listen to me? If you really have something to say, you can find an audience on social media, and you know, eventually people like me will catch on. Hey, this person really has something interesting to say, and you can get a lot of exposure that way. The problem with social media, though, is that I think it works a lot better with small thoughts and simple thoughts, things that are not very complex, and things that may be one-dimensional. And what social media, when I live tweet a political event, for example, what am I tweeting out? Sound bites. I'm tweeting out sound bites because I can fit them in 140 characters. Unless somebody comes back and reads my whole column later, they're not going to get the context. What they're going to get is, you know, very a very shallow, probably, view of the event that happened.
Joseph?
And so I try to combine social media with longer form writing.
We have a gentleman right over here.
Yeah, Kay, you mentioned how candidates live in fear of macaca moments, and yet we have a president-elect who set a Guinness record for macaca moments. From the time he called John McCain a loser on through the campaign. And isn't the fear part of it that the course campaign wins votes? And if Alan had a macaca moment today, that he might have fared better in his candidacy than he did 20 years ago?
Others on the panel may disagree, but I think the thing that people miss about Trump's appeal is that people found him to be genuine. They found him to be crass. They found him to say outrageous things, but they found that to be his personality, that he wasn't faking it.
Dave Nagle?
Yeah, one of the mistakes the Clinton campaign made, among many, was the fact that they kept going after Trump and his macaca moments, and there were innumerable. And people said, yeah, we know that, but he tells it like it is. And that 44% was never going to leave him because they perceived him as genuine. Meanwhile, every time Clinton would turn and start talking about their opponent's flaws on the theory that they could convince the public not to vote for him because he was a great risk, she left her discussion of the economy, and her numbers in proportion dipped accordingly. Look, it is what it is. It's unfortunate that that kind of language found its way into the White House. He's the president of the United States, however, and I think we better move on. And we better figure out as Democrats why we lost and what we can do to win. But I think treading that decision again doesn't get us anywhere, even though it may be for you and me regrettable.
There is irony in the fact that the candidate who was married to the 1992 candidate who had a sign in his headquarters that read, "It's the economy, stupid," didn't talk that much about
George
the economy.
Stephanopoulos said,
There is an aspect of this, so that we forget. You have a huge disenchantment in America that's related to that we've just had the two longest wars in our history, arguably the two most debilitating wars, and a man-made recession. And there was a revolt against the political establishment. And so you had two outsiders that were speaking a kind of anti-establishment lingo.
I think that's
And Bernie Sanders ran, in my view, one of the most thoughtful campaigns in the history of the United States, even though I would differ with some of his theses. And you had the true outsider who should have been understood by every Iowan in particular, because right out of the 19th century, he was a medicine man with an elixir. That I will make America great again. Believe me. Well, that sold. I mean, he was a legitimate medicine man. Yeah.
Out of all of the vile things that were said during the campaign, I think the dirtiest word was Washington. And, if you called somebody a Washington insider or a creature of Washington, that was the kiss of death, as opposed to, crooked Hillary. No, that wasn't the problem. The problem was that she had spent so many years in Washington.
Years ago, I was campaigning, and I was walking in my, I think, 5th parade of the day, and I got up to, I think it was Osage, Iowa, and I was going down Main Street, and I was right behind the high school band. And somebody yelled out from the crowd just as the band quit playing, "Dave, remember us poor farmers." And it's the 6th parade of the day, or the 5th, and I was hot and tired, and I yelled back, "Yes, sir, I will if I ever meet one." And needless to say, I didn't. Yeah, that was kind of their reaction too.
You're not as smart as I thought.
I never said I was.
You may have missed that. Jim Leach said to his colleague, "You're not as smart as I thought."
Well, hell, I lost, Jim. I only got 3 terms. But here's the thing about it, though. There is a need. There is a need. Listen, perhaps to tell the public more of what they need to understand. and not simply to continue as public officials and public office holders and even as columnists and writers, not to always tell us what we want to hear. These are tough times. These are challenges both here and abroad, and they're going to require sacrifice, they're going to require effort, and they're not going to get everything we want every day. The government isn't going to run perfectly. And I think one of the things we can do, how do we bring people together? Number one is to tell the body politic, it's time we all start exercising a little more maturity in terms of our expectations of what government can and can't do. And when it falls short in one spot, doesn't mean the entire government is therefore corrupt and the swamp needs to be drained in Washington.
Dave, just as, while you have the floor, have Democrats ever been in a more disadvantageous position?
Oh, I think
in Washington and in Iowa than they are right now.
I think the Democrats better recognize it's going to be an awful long road back.
No, it isn't.
You got 900 state legislators. I'll get you. We got 900 state legislators we've lost since Obama became president. You got every Republican legislature in the states now doing the district lines. You're going to have a crease even in Iowa, making it harder for Democratic constituencies to vote. You've got a president that controls the message that's going to be delivered to the country. And historically, Democrats are the party out of power gains in the next off-year election. I'm not sure that's going to happen this time. I think you might see the Congress go even heavier to the right and the Iowa Senate and House go heavier to the right. It's going to be a tough slog for us.
But Jim Leach, a Republican, was disagreeing with you, weren't you, Jim?
Well, if the Republican presidential cabinet and policies work, the Democratic Party is in severe difficulty. If you have a suspicion that they might not, what an opportunity for a political party in the minority.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you can get the message out, but with the media, the state that it's in, the capacity for organized dissent or public dissent, I think, has been greatly diminished and somewhat restricted. I agree with you if we can get the message out, but I'm not sure modern media practices will permit us to do that.
Dennis?
Well, on this note, I've been saying for quite some time, there are 5 factors that mean a likely Republican vote. If you're older, white, male, rural, Southern. Older, white, male, rural, Southern. Those are the 5 factors that correlate with a likely Republican vote. Now, the good thing for Republicans is those folks show up, as you saw big time this last week. The bad thing is, in the long run, not this time, but in the long run, those are declining demographics. For Democrats, 3 core constituencies are single women, younger people, and minorities. Those are growing constituencies. The bad thing for Democrats is they don't show up to vote. That's the problem. And midterms particularly are tilted toward Republicans because most Republicans, while there is some decline, will still show up to vote. Democratic voters don't turn out.
Joseph?
So we have a couple more questions before we end. This gentleman right here.
Thank you. I come from Illinois, and I can remember our 2 senators that began with a D, Douglas and Dirksen. And they would often talk, when referring to the other one, my esteemed colleague, or my friend, from Southern Illinois, or whatever. And there was not just a civility, but they came from the middle of the road of both parties. And I think that it's our gerrymandering that is set by the individual states that brings in, that encourages the most radical people in the primaries to become elected, and then we have the far ends of the bell curve arguing against one another, where the 70% of us in the middle don't participate.
Okay.
How can we get the gerrymandering changed?
Well, is the answer to that the way that Iowa does it? But how are you going to get other states to adopt that? Kay?
Well, as you may have heard, former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder is now leading a group of Democrats who hope to do just that, flip legislatures at the state level in order to redraft congressional lines by the time of the next census. Now that is going to be a hefty, hefty haul.
Well, Dave Nagle,
maybe they can do it again after the following census in 10 years.
you have been both in the Congress and in the Iowa legislature.
No, I wasn't, Dean. I was chair, but I was never in the Iowa legislature. No, I'm not guilty of that one. Don't hang that one on me. I've never been. I don't even know anybody that goes up there.
Okay. I thought that you were part at one time of redistricting in Iowa.
No.
Okay, all right. Jim Leach, any comment on that
But
question?
that won't stop me from, I don't know anything about it, but that won't stop me.
Well, first, the premise is right, that Iowa has reason to be proud. We have an outstanding redistricting system of nonpartisan decision-making. The second thing, though, is there are two traumas. One relates to redistricting in many states, and California generally leans towards redistricting Democratic, but they've got a new process too. But the second thing, and I want to add on to some things that Dennis said earlier, the money in politics issue means that campaigns nationwide are being nationalized. That is, the same big money people give to the same groups in each state. And so when the founders talked about we're going to have a variety of people elected, wedded to a variety of local interests, that no longer is near the case when you're talking about the Congress. I mean, oil companies give to a given type in every state in the country, unions give to a given type in every state in the country, and then you combine these two issues of money in politics and redistricting, and one of the things that occurs, because 85% of congressional districts are relatively safe with one party or the other, is the questioner mentioned somewhat about being from the middle. The middle is truly being eroded in both political parties, particularly the Republican Party, but the Democratic Party doesn't have much of a middle either. And so you're having arguably the largest part of the body politic in the United States of America, which is kind of center-left, center-right, the least represented in a legislative body because of institutional reasons related to money and related to redistricting.
Just a quick follow-up from Dave Nagle and then Kathie Obradovich.
I don't know how deep you want to go here, but listen, one of the problems with the money that Jim has pointed out is that you no longer have to be a Republican loyal to the Republican Party. You can be, and you should be, a Republican loyal to the interest groups and the money that is obtained your seat for you. And the same with the Democratic Party. One of the cures to Congress is the fact that we need to, and this will surprise you, we need to strengthen political parties, again, so they have some discipline over their members, so we don't have a Senate of 100 individual members and a Congress, a House of 435 individual members, each free to go their own way. You need inter-party discipline. Inter-party discipline only comes if you have strong political parties. You don't have strong political parties if you have independent sources of resource like we have today.
Speaking, he's wrong.
Kathy?
The questioner, it's not just about who you elect, it's about what they do when they get to Congress. And you mentioned the civility, you know, speaking about my friend across the aisle. Part of the problem we see in Congress now is that members of opposite parties do not have personal relationships with each other. They don't spend time together. They go home every weekend to their districts. And they don't have personal relationships that would allow them to perhaps overcome some of the polarized philosophical positions and work together on things that you know, might fall into the middle. How do you solve that? One of the issues, I mean, first of all, they have to create an environment where it's encouraged, as opposed to, you know, if a Democrat talks to a Republican on the floor, that they end up on social media and people questioning, why would you do that? Why would you talk to somebody from the other party? The other part is that in some of the political processes have taken away some of the incentives for members to get to know each other. However, in Iowa, Joni Ernst has created a good example She is collaborating with members of the opposite party on issues of interest, particularly military issues, veterans issues. One of her best friends in the U.S. Senate is Kirsten Gillibrand, who is a Democrat. So I do think that there's hope, but I think we as voters have to encourage that.
Kathie,
as well.
we'll try to squeeze in one more question here. Go
Yeah,
ahead, Joseph.
we're out of time, so who's the last person here?
Can't get a word in edgewise with you politicians.
Akeo Abdul Samad. Over the course of several decades, we have watched communities, nationalities feel disenfranchised from the whole political system. We actually saw it happen, especially in this election. The question is, when do we start listening to the people in the United States that do feel disenfranchised? The division between rural and urban has been there for several decades, between African Americans, Caucasians, Latinos. We have all felt
Let me get to the nut of it. You said, when do we start listening to each other?
Yeah, no, not just each other. How do we get politicians to start listening to people in the community instead of just to each other?
I'll give you the answer.
All right,
to
all
that.
right.
And
Dennis,
start addressing those issues with those individuals who feel disenfranchised, so we're not looking at the same issue in 2020.
Got
I'll
it.
give you
And
an
Dennis,
answer.
if you will
And-
answer that quickly,
Yes,
then
it's-
I'm going to go to one more question here in the front row. Go ahead.
It's simple but powerful. People complain that politicians don't listen to them, so I'm not going to participate. Politicians should say, why should I listen to you? Because you don't participate. You've got to get people to turn out and participate. Vote, absolutely. Look, if George Wallace and Strom Thurmond, racist segregationists, once African Americans got a secure right to register and vote in the South, if those guys started paying attention to the African American population, you know anybody else would. And so it's the fact that when people don't vote, it's like catnip, if not heroin, to politicians, right? If you vote, they will listen to you. If you don't vote, they've got no reason to.
And we're running out of time. One more.
Well,
You're on.
well said. I would point out, give some hope to the Democratic Party, that in 1976, I stood in the airport, Apley Airport, and looked at the headline in the Omaha World Herald after the Watergate thing in the election of Jimmy Carter. The Republican Party is dead. It's on its last legs. And within, actually a few weeks, the Iowa Republican Party, Jim Leach, had been elected in the 76 election, and we elected 3 legislators. And in 78, we took back the Iowa legislature and carried for Reagan in 80.
Your point is it can be done.
The point is, like Mark Twain used to say, the death has been highly exaggerated.
Okay.
That's the wonderful thing about it.
I think that's a statement, unless somebody else wants to comment on that.
I'll go with that.
Follow that.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dean, and thank you all of our panelists for being here this evening, answering all of our questions and presenting us with these great ideas. So I appreciate you being here tonight.